welcome to this episode of the Rise to Reign podcast. This is the third episode in a little mini series that we're doing on polarity. So if you missed the first one on what polarity is, we're talking about gender polarity. That would have been season 2, episode 9. You can go back and start there. Then last week, I did femininity. And so this week is masculinity. And as I'm going through and preparing content, I'm realizing that there's probably actually even going to be a fourth episode on how these two interact. And a lot of questions have come up about what to do when you find yourself accessing or living in an energy that isn't authentic to you, or exhibiting the traits out of an unhealthy personality or style of relating. And so I'm going to handle that next week. So this week we're going to focus on masculinity. So I want to start off by saying that, again, I've mentioned it over and over again, that this is a topic where angels fear to tread because there's so much conflict, and that conflict is really born out of a lot of unmet expectations, a lot of hurt feelings, a lot of trauma, childhood wounds from a primary caregiver, as well as hurtful relationships that have gone on in our past or maybe our present between the male-female, masculine-feminine dynamic. So my heart here is to really begin to heal some of that by self-awareness, understanding, and emotional healing. And I want to say and be very clear about my position is that I love men. I absolutely love men. And that is a blanket statement, I realize, but there are so many forces that are seeking to denigrate men and denigrate masculinity. And men, for all that we talk about women and how they have been oppressed and marginalized, and they have, and I'm not minimizing that, but men have too. Men are hurting deeply. And it is my heart to heal that and to help and create space for men to heal and rise into their most authentic selves as masculine people. Also, I have 2 sons, and so it's very, very close to my heart to watch them develop into healthy masculine men and to rise up and take their place in as godly men in the world. So, with that being said, I want to also start off with this statement. This is kind of a buzzword right now that's going around, is toxic masculinity, and I don't believe in it. I don't even believe that such a thing exists. There is no such thing as toxic masculinity, because masculinity is very, very healing and a very, very provisional and very, very necessary. Remember, we need both the masculine and the feminine to express the true nature and the true image of God. And so masculinity in its true form is a very, very, very good thing. It's a beautiful thing. It's a healing thing. It's a necessary thing. So there's no such thing as toxic masculinity. There's masculinity, and then there's something that looks like masculinity that isn't. And so we're kind of going to parse that out and sort of make the distinction between what is a healthy male and maybe what is a not healthy or an unhealthy male. And those two things are really opposite. So as we understand godly masculinity, divine masculine, it will help us understand that what is referred to as toxic masculinity, which is really behavior by an unhealthy man or male person. So unhealthy men are typically boys who grow old, but they never grow up. So we're going to talk about that maturation process and what needs to happen. Because when we see what we normally refer to toxic masculinity, it's a boy in a man's body. Basically, it is a male who is a boy who grew old but never grew up. So, and it's never too late. It's never too late to grow up. In fact, that is what the Rise to Reign process is really all about, is rising up and maturing emotionally, spiritually, mentally, physically. So All right, so what are some of the masculine qualities? And I really do encourage you to go listen to the last episode if you haven't yet, because I did get quite a bit into masculinity already, because it's really impossible to understand femininity without understanding masculinity. And conversely, it's impossible to understand masculinity without understanding femininity. It's like polar opposites. So it's like, we understand what cold is because it's not hot, or we understand what fast is because it's not slow. So it's useful to understand a thing by its opposite. So at the core, at the hot lava core of masculinity are three things. It's protection, provision, and presiding. So, or leading, or when you think of like the president. I'm not saying that a woman couldn't or shouldn't be president. I would love to see a female president. But when you think about presiding, that's a very masculine quality, is like taking responsibility for everything in his realm, under his domain. That's presiding and taking ownership and leading in that space is a very masculine quality. So protecting, providing, and presiding it's like the hot lava core of masculinity. So when we talk about what's usually referred to as toxic masculinity or immature masculinity, or maybe an unhealthy male person exhibiting some qualities that might be confused with masculinity, it's really the opposite of that. So an unhealthy man shows up not to protect, but to really aggress and to perpetrate, and to be a predator. Really, instead of protecting, he is predating, or he is looking to victimize. And so same with provision, an unhealthy male, and there's varying degrees of toxicity in this, right? Or varying degrees of like nefarious motives. Some can be very, very, very virulent or malignant, and some can be very innocuous and benign, but still annoying and not what is needed from a man. So provision, the second quality, is an unhealthy male will show up to get instead of to give. That's like the taker instead of the maker. And this is really a maturity issue, is showing up in a situation or in a relationship and seeing what they can get instead of what they can give. And there are different stages of development for men. Obviously a 50-year-old man, a 60-year-old man, a father, a grandfather, versus a college student. There's all sorts of spectrums to be had there. Okay, so in addition to protecting, providing, and presiding, we have some other qualities that are distinctly masculine. The masculine highly prizes and values freedom. So the masculine wants to be able to come and go as it pleases, and this is often in conflict with some other desires that he has, like to protect, provide, and preside. And so this is one of the conflicts that men find themselves in, is wanting to be a provider and wanting to protect the tribe, but also wanting to run free and not have responsibility. So that's again a maturation issue. I handled this quite a bit last week, but strategy is a very masculine quality, strategy and execution. Healthy masculinity also, again, takes ownership. That's part of presiding, as well as empowers and lifts others up and develops. Healthy masculinity uses restraint. It's very, very restrained. It's very strong, but it's strength under control. So there's a quote by Jordan Peterson that I absolutely love. And he says that a safe man is a dangerous man that has that danger under control. I'm probably butchering the quote, but that's the feeling, or the general idea, is that a safe man is not a not dangerous man. A safe man is a very, very dangerous man that has his strength and his danger under control. So using restraint is a very masculine quality. as well as providing safety. So this is again protection, but you can feel the presence of a very masculine man. It just exudes safety. You feel safe around a man who is very, very identified with his masculinity. And again, I handled this last week, but the masculine is very inclined and predisposed toward emptying out. So men are generous. That is usually the case. But what happens and what turns this and what makes women think that men are awful and evil is because often men are put into a position where they are needing to protect themselves from women and maybe from the people that they are supposed to be protecting. And that is because of the unhealthy style of relating. And so what I really want to cover, because I've covered the qualities pretty much ad nauseum of what is masculine and what is feminine. And next week we're going to get into, like, if you're a feminine person, but you've put on this style of relating, or you've armored up with masculinity, how do you get back into femininity? And if you're a man and you have maybe not identified strongly with your masculine qualities, how do you get back into that? And then how do these two things interplay? So I'm going to handle that next week. But one topic that I feel like has to be handled here is emasculation. So this episode is really about emasculation. So when you emasculate a person, it's really the idea of castrating them. And I know that is physically repulsive, but it's the energetic quality of castrating or taking away the manhood of a man. You can also emasculate women, though, and children. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. I love Alison Armstrong's definition of emasculation, and that is to reduce or eliminate a person's ability to produce results. So producing results is a very, very masculine quality. Crossing the finish line, winning, going for something is very, very masculine. Producing a result is very, very masculine. So when you, by your behavior, men do it to men, women often do it to men without understanding or knowing it, and women do it to women. But emasculation is reducing or eliminating a person's ability to produce results, according to Alison Armstrong. There's other definitions, obviously, but I really, really like hers because it works. And so how do we emasculate, specifically men as women? That's kind of what I want to talk about, is we complain. That's very, very emasculating. We criticize. Very, very emasculating. We belittle, and we take over. So this is kind of the idea of, well, if you want something done right, you got to do it yourself. And so we see him not taking out the trash, or we see him not putting his socks in the laundry hamper, and we get disgusted, and then we just go and we just do it for ourselves, and then we're resentful, and we think that he is such a loser because he didn't do what he was supposed to do. And when we act like that, we emasculate him. We do this to our children. We do this to each other. So our culture, especially feminism, teaches boys and men that masculine qualities are bad, so they put on a feminine mask. So when boys, if you'll notice, I have two of them, and one of them is a teenager and the other one is a preteen. And you'll notice as they're growing up, if you've ever been around boys, is they're very aggressive and they're wild. And I love it. And I do everything that I can to encourage this behavior in my boys. I didn't always, because I didn't really understand this when they were littler. But now I do everything that I can to encourage their wildness and their aggressiveness, because that's their design. And that is what is needed in the world. And if you have a boy, you've been around young boys, you'll also notice that they love weaponry, and they love guns, and they love swords, and they love to, play ninja, and they love to, they're warriors, and they love to be in battle. And so, because of what has been termed toxic masculinity, or the propensity of men to aggress against somebody that's weaker than them, we have taken the baby and thrown it out with the bathwater and said that aggression is bad and that is not a good quality, and you need to be more like women. And so when we do that, we emasculate them. But there is a very, very critical element here that we all need to see. And that is that healthy masculinity aggresses on behalf of. That's how they protect, is they aggress on behalf of. Think about a man going to war. I know women go to war too, but in this context, think about a man going to war to protect the village or to protect the tribe. Healthy masculinity is aggressive, but it aggresses on behalf of. Unhealthy masculinity aggresses against. And it's really, really sad when this happens, because usually when a man aggresses against somebody that they're supposed to be protecting, it's because they have to protect themselves from the person that they're supposed to be protecting, because that person is aggressing against them and emasculating them. And so their choices are to, when demands are made of them, their choices are to either submit or to defy. And neither one of those are really good. Neither one of those are really good options. There's a better option. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more next week. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But for this episode, what I really want us to see here is that when we emasculate little boys and, young men and tell them that these qualities are bad, instead of helping them understand the context in which they are useful, it is really, really, really bad for our society and for our culture. And so what we see today is a feminization of our men. And this is, obviously very, very obvious in the transgender, where men are actually dressing as women and putting makeup on. That's the kind of the extreme of the spectrum. But even men who would consider themselves manly and heterosexual are wearing this mask of femininity, because our culture has told them that masculinity is bad, and that to be strong and to be aggressive and to be results driven and oriented is bad, and they need to back that off, and they need to embrace the really good qualities, which are to share and to be nice and to be really castrated and ineffective. And so the reason where this gets really, really, really muddy is that we teach women, that our culture teaches women that their qualities are soft and useless in the workplace, and we teach men that their qualities are bad and should be overcome in the home. And so, as you can see, that's where it creates these problems, because women and feminine people in their role, when they're protected and provided for, that's when they actually blossom and become powerful. And masculine people in their role really blossom and become powerful when they're allowed to, not allowed, because that would be emasculating to say that you have to allow a man to do anything, but when they're given this space, I should say, when they're given this space to be men and to protect and to provide and to lead. Now, I want to be really careful, because I'm not saying that women can't and shouldn't lead. We need women leaders. We need women to be leaders, but we need women to be leaders as women, and we need men to be leaders as men. And when we take the masculine qualities and we denigrate them and we emasculate them, what happens is, to be loved and to be accepted, boys will put on a feminine mask. And so they're sensitive, and they're the metrosexual guy that's like your best buddy, and you can talk to them about everything, and they listen to you, and they go shopping with you, and it feels really great, but there's absolutely no sexual attraction. Why? Because sexual attraction is based on polarity. So the further you are on the polarity spectrum apart from each other, the more attraction there's going to be. And so we feminize men and we masculinize women, and then we wonder why we have so many problems. And as I talked about last episode, the result of a woman encountering feminized men is that she's not threatened. So she feels safe in a way that she's not threatened, but she also feels this incredible sense of contempt because she innately sees that as weakness. And so how we get past this is really, really going to be handled. It's really important. It's going to be handled in the next episode. But as going along the kind of development of how men are emasculated is that as boys we teach them that their masculine qualities are bad. And instead of teaching them how to channel them appropriately, we just teach them that they're bad and that they should be more feminine. So they put on a feminine mask. As they get older, they realize that, hey, I'm not attracting women. I'm not attracting women because I am feminine. And so they put on a masculine mask. I talked about how women do this too. But they put on a masculine mask. And then that's what we see as toxic masculinity. This is when, they're chasing women and they're not honoring women, and they are, trying to get ahead, and they'll step on anybody's head to get there, and creating this like false sense of bravado. And so that's when masculinity becomes toxic, is when it's a masculine mask on top of a feminine mask. So the solution is to take off both of those masks and come back to the core of healthy masculinity, and not only celebrate masculinity, but also create the space for masculinity to thrive. And for that to happen, women have to back off of the masculine side of the pole, and they also have to learn to interact with masculinity in a way that is non-threatening. And I say that very carefully because it is threatening. I'll tell you, when you have a history of maybe interacting with toxic masculinity and you're confronted with masculinity, it can be triggering for a woman. I can speak from experience. But there is a way to soften into that and to be with it. And you realize as a woman in the presence of true and authentic masculinity that you're able to blossom and become more powerful when you're protected and provided. And this isn't just in romantic relationships. Of course it applies to romantic relationships, but I'm talking about even, like the mother-son relationship. I'm talking about the father-daughter relationship. I'm talking about men and women working together. I'm talking about men and women doing ministry in church or government organizations together. Is that what needs to shift in our society is that men need to be strong men and women need to be strong women, but as women. And so emasculation is really a problem where we reduce or eliminate a person's ability to produce results by complaining, criticizing, belittling, or taking over. So really, what we'll talk about next week is that the masculine really responds to the feminine. That's just kind of the way of things, is that the masculine responds to the feminine. So in this way, I really feel like this is women's area to go first in, and that is to back out of the masculine position and to create that space for men to rise in to masculinity and to be able to lead as men. So one thing before I close, and we're getting close to the time where we need to close, and I'm going to have a lot to say about this in the next episode as well and take it a little bit further. However, I do want to mention that there is, I believe the feminization of men in our culture and our society is intentional. I believe it's part of a sort of master plan, because we see what's going on in our world with the victimization of children and the victimization of women and the sort of takeover of maybe nefarious forces. So I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think we're at a place where we all need to open our eyes and see what's going on in the world. And it's the men, it's the strong, masculine warrior men that protect the tribe. And just because we have houses with picket fences and cars and, men aren't wearing fur and carrying clubs and going out and finding food on the savannah, we're no less a tribal society, a communal society. And so we need strong men to protect the tribe. And when the men are not strong, the tribe is vulnerable. And so we see millions and millions of women and children, and some men, but mostly women and children in the sex trafficking industry. And we see children, fatherless children, getting into all kinds of confusion and trouble and violence, and all of the societal problems, I believe, can be traced back to this issue of not having strong fathers. And so it's easy to point the finger at men and be like, you are failing. You are failing. You are not doing your job. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. But what is that when we do that? It's complaining. It's criticizing. As women, when we do that, when we say, the men aren't showing up, so we have to, that's where we go with it, right? Is like when the man isn't showing up, we're like, well, I have to show up. If you're not showing up, then I have to. And so it's kind of this vicious cycle where we as women are mad at the men for not showing up and not being that strong presence. And our response to that is to complain, criticize, belittle, and take over. And so that emasculates him, and it doesn't solve our problem. Now, we're not having a conversation about whether or not that's justified or whether or not we are entitled or deserve to have our feelings. It is not the point, because when you're a sovereign individual, when you take radical responsibility, your focus is on outcomes. So what's your outcome? Well, our outcome needs to be to remasculate men. We need to remasculate men, not emasculate, but remasculate. We need to remasculate men. And so, yes, it's up to men to rise into masculinity and to take that position to protect and to provide and to preside. But we have to create the space as women for them to do that. And we also have to stop the things that we do to denigrate them, to marginalize them, to minimize them, and to emasculate them. And it starts with every relationship you have in your life with men. It starts with your sons. Obviously, if you're raising sons, it starts there. It starts with your workplace. It starts with your church. It starts with your community outreach. It starts obviously in the family. So we need to create the space for men to be able to produce the results that we need them to produce, which is protection, provision, and them presiding and leading. And so in order to do that, we have to make a commitment to stop emasculating. Obviously, men and boys, but men emasculate each other and women emasculate each other. So when we complain, criticize, belittle, and take over, we reduce or eliminate the ability for that person to produce results. And so we need to make a change here. This is part of the Rise to Reign process, is becoming self-aware. So I have an assignment, I have a challenge for you for this week, is to pay attention. Pay attention to when you complain, criticize, belittle, or take over, specifically with the men in your life, but even with other women or yourself, because we do this. We have this standard of perfection that we hold ourselves to and that we hold everybody else to, and that's the princess. And so the queen shows up, and when the queen shows up, she calls them the king. She calls the prince really up to the king, and he does the same for her. He rescues her right back. And so we need each other to be able to rise into our most authentic self in this area of femininity and masculinity and polarity, because as such, we need both healthy masculine and healthy feminine to express the true image and the true nature of God. And so, how does this fit into the Rise to Reign process? Well, remember that God wants you healed so you can wholeheartedly live your purpose and live your life. And a big part of healing is healing the God imprint of your gender design, of your polarity. And in order to do that, in order for us to heal as women, we need to heal simultaneously with the masculine, and we need the strong presence of the authentic masculine to fully express as women. So it's not either or, it's both and. And so we're going to talk about next week about how we actually interact and how we do that. But that's it for now. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Rise to Reign podcast, and I'll see you next week.